Imagine for a second that you were a detective in New York City in 1975. The city is loud, chaotic, drowning in its own filth and corruption. You know a murder happened. You have the motive, a gambling debt, a romantic betrayal, or maybe just a perceived insult at the wrong social club. You have the suspect, a known associate with connections to one of the five families. You even have a witness who heard the scream from an alleyway, a brief cry that pierced through the rumble of garbage trucks making their early morning rounds. But you have a problem, a massive, career-ending, sleep-destroying problem that is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. There is no body. There is no blood spatter on brick walls. There's no DNA evidence waiting to be analyzed in some laboratory. The person didn't just die. They evaporated. They vanished as completely as morning fog under the harsh light of the New York sun. In the history of the American Mafia, the gun was optional, a tool of intimidation more than necessity. The silencer was useful. It bought you precious seconds before neighbors started dialing the police. But the most dangerous weapon the mob ever owned, the tool that made them truly untouchable, was a truck. Not just any truck, but a 20-ton steel monster that roams your streets every single morning, so common and mundane that you don't even notice it anymore. While you drink your coffee in your tiny apartment, while you read the morning paper filled with stories about organized crime and political corruption, a machine outside your window is exerting 3,000 pounds of pressure per square inch on something in the back. By the time you finish your breakfast, maybe eggs and toast, maybe a bagel from the corner deli, that something has been crushed into a cube the size of a microwave, mixed with coffee grounds and broken glass and yesterday's newspapers, and buried under 50 feet of dirt in a landfill across state lines, where no one will ever think to look. Welcome to the disposal business, the most brilliant, terrifying, and efficient criminal enterprise the American underworld has ever created. Most people think the mafia got into the garbage business because it was easy money, a simple shakedown operation where you collect payments from businesses too scared to refuse. They are wrong. They are fundamentally misunderstanding the genius of what was built. The mob didn't just want the contracts and the steady cash flow. They wanted the access. They wanted the infrastructure. They wanted the one commodity that no law enforcement agency could ever fully control. If you control the garbage, you control the one thing that leaves every building in the city without being searched, without being questioned, without anyone giving it a second thought. You have a fleet of vehicles that can go anywhere at any time, pick up anything, and destroy it within seconds. You have workers who show up before dawn when the streets are empty and witnesses are asleep. You have dumps and transfer stations where visibility is zero and questions are never asked. It was the perfect cover for the perfect crime. Today, we're opening the books on the darkest industry in organized crime. We aren't talking about gambling chips stacked in smoke-filled back rooms or stolen cars chopped up in Jersey warehouses. We're talking about the Sanitation Racket, an empire built on waste, maintained through terror, and protected by the simple fact that nobody wants to look too closely at garbage. I'm going to show you how families in New York and Chicago turned a public utility into a private graveyard. I'm going to show you why the FBI couldn't find Jimmy Hoffa despite decades of investigation and millions of dollars spent. And I'm going to take you inside the terrifying mechanics of how a human being becomes a statistic, a missing person report that eventually goes cold in some filing cabinet. Buckle up. It's going to get dirty. You have to understand the genius of this operation from a pure business perspective. Waste management is the perfect racket, the ultimate captive market. Think about it carefully. If you run a restaurant, you can choose not to buy fancy linens for your tables.
You can choose not to renovate the dining room or invest in expensive artwork. You can cut corners on marketing or reduce your menu offerings, but you cannot choose to stop producing trash. It is a biological fact, an inevitable consequence of human existence. It is a constant that flows like a river through every commercial enterprise in the city. In the 1950s and 60s, the mob, always looking for new revenue streams, always seeking ways to legitimize their operations while maintaining criminal control, realized that garbage was a utility, just like electricity or water or gas. And if you control the utility, if you become the indispensable service that cannot be avoided, you control the city. Not through flashy displays of violence or public intimidation, but through quiet, systematic domination of essential infrastructure. They created a system called property rights. Now that sounds like a legitimate legal term, doesn't it? It sounds corporate, professional, like something you'd read about in business school. But in the underworld, property rights meant something very specific and deeply sinister. It meant that every stop, every deli serving pastrami sandwiches to construction workers, every garment factory in the garment district, every construction site building the towers of Manhattan belonged to a specific hauler forever. There was no competition in the free market sense. There was no shopping around for a better price or negotiating terms. If a legitimate businessman, someone who actually wanted to run an honest operation, tried to enter the market and offer a lower rate to pick up trash, he would find sugar in his gas tank the next morning. If he didn't get the message, if he stubbornly persisted in his attempt to compete, his trucks would simply catch fire in the yard, mysterious blazes that the fire department would write off as electrical problems or arson by unknown parties. It was a monopoly enforced by terror, but it was disguised as a blue-collar service hidden behind union contracts and industry associations. And the money? The money was staggering, almost incomprehensible in scale. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in cash flowing through shell companies with innocuous names, paying for the lifestyles of bosses who lived in sprawling mansions on Long Island with swimming pools and tennis courts and wives who wore fur coats to the supermarket. But the money was just the surface, the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. The real value of the garbage industry wasn't what they took out of the city in terms of revenue. It was what they could hide inside the system: weapons, drugs, stolen goods, and yes, bodies.
I want you to imagine a scenario now, and I warn you, this is where the story gets cold, where we move from business analysis into the realm of genuine horror. Imagine you are a problem for the organization. Maybe you were a witness to a murder who might testify in court. Maybe you skimmed money from a gambling operation, thinking no one would notice a few thousand here and there. Maybe you slept with the wrong person's wife, or insulted a made man at a wedding, or simply became a liability that needed to be eliminated. The order comes down through the chain of command, whispered in social clubs and passed through intermediaries. You have to go. In the movies, the hitman leaves the body in the street as a message to others who might think about betraying the family. Or they drive 5 hours to a remote forest in upstate New York to dig a hole in the frozen ground. But in reality, that's sloppy. That's dangerous. That's the kind of mistake that gets you caught. Police find bodies in streets, and suddenly there's media attention and public pressure for arrests. Hikers find shallow graves, and cadaver dogs lead investigators to unmarked burial sites. Forensic science was advancing rapidly in the 1970s. New techniques for analyzing trace evidence, better methods for determining time of death, sophisticated ways to match victims to suspects. They needed a way to bypass the investigation entirely, to make the problem disappear so completely that there wouldn't even be a case to investigate. Enter the rear-loading garbage truck, a marvel of modern engineering that would become an instrument of death. These machines are genuinely impressive from a mechanical standpoint. They have a hopper in the back where the waste goes, a large cavity that can hold several tons of refuse. And inside that hopper is a packer blade, a hydraulic ram powered by the truck's engine. Now, I'm not going to get graphic here. I don't need to paint you a detailed picture. I just want you to think about the physics involved, the sheer mechanical force at work. That hydraulic blade exerts thousands of pounds per square inch, enough force to crush old furniture into splinters, to flatten wooden pallets, to compress steel drums until they are completely flat. If a problem is placed into that hopper at 3 a.m. during that quiet hour when even New York City sleeps, and the lever is pulled by a driver who has been paid to forget what he's doing, the evidence isn't just hidden. It is structurally altered at a molecular level. It is compressed into a dense block of refuse mixed with industrial sludge and household waste and construction debris. Within 30 seconds, maybe less, the problem ceases to look like a person and starts to look like just another cubic yard of city waste, indistinguishable from the tons of garbage that the city produces every single day. The truck finishes its route, making its normal rounds, picking up more and more trash at each stop. It picks up tons of other garbage on top of it: restaurant waste, office papers, construction materials, household trash. Each load adds another layer, another barrier between the evidence and discovery. By the time the sun comes up, painting the city in shades of orange and gold, that truck is dumping its load into a barge headed for Staten Island, or directly into a landfill in New Jersey. Have you ever seen a landfill? Have you ever stood at the edge and looked out over the landscape of waste? It is an ocean of chaos, a dystopian vista that stretches to the horizon. Seagulls circle overhead, their cries mixing with the beep, beep, beep of bulldozers pushing garbage into massive piles. There are layers upon layers of debris, decades of waste compressed and covered and forgotten. Trying to find a specific piece of evidence in a landfill is not like finding a needle in a haystack. It is like finding a needle in a mountain range of needles, each one identical to the last. The FBI knew this. They had intelligence reports, wiretaps, informants whispering about disappearances. They knew that men were walking out of their houses in the morning and vanishing off the face of the earth. They had wiretaps where wise guys would joke about taking out the trash, laughing about their victims as if they were discussing yard work. But knowing it and proving it are two entirely different things. You can't get a search warrant for 1 million tons of garbage. You can't excavate an entire landfill on a hunch. This is why the Sanitation Racket was the ultimate shield, the perfect criminal enterprise. It provided the two things every criminal organization needs to survive and thrive: infinite money laundering opportunities and total physical impunity for murder investigations.
Let's look at the man who became the face of this industry, the quiet administrator who ran the garbage empire with ruthless efficiency, James Failla. They called him Jimmy Brown. Jimmy Brown wasn't flashy like some of his contemporaries. He didn't wear bright suits like John Gotti, who would later become famous for his custom-tailored outfits and expensive accessories. He didn't hold court in expensive restaurants or drive flashy sports cars. He looked like a librarian or a mid-level accountant, the kind of man you wouldn't notice if he sat next to you on the subway. He was quiet, soft-spoken, incredibly cautious about everything he said and did. But for decades, he was the shadow king of New York's private sanitation industry for the Gambino family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. His office wasn't a social club where mobsters gathered to drink espresso and play cards. It was the trade association headquarters, a legitimate-looking business office with filing cabinets and secretaries and phones ringing all day. He sat there, day after day, year after year, managing the routes with the precision of a logistics expert. He decided which company got which contract, mediating disputes between carters, setting prices, enforcing the property rights system that kept everyone in line. He was essentially the CEO of the underworld's most essential utility. FBI agents who surveilled him said it was the most boring job in the world, mind-numbing in its routine. He would drive to work in an unremarkable car,
sit in his office shuffling papers and making phone calls, and drive home to his family. But that boredom was a carefully constructed mask. Behind those closed doors, in conversations that were never recorded, Jimmy Brown held the power to shut down New York City whenever he wanted. Imagine New York City after 3 days without garbage collection. Try to picture it in your mind. The smell of rotting food wafting through the streets in summer heat, the rats emerging from sewers to feast on overflowing trash bags, the disease vectors multiplying exponentially. It's effectively a biological weapon, a way to hold the entire city hostage without firing a single shot. The politicians would panic as constituents flooded their offices with complaints. The public would scream for action, for someone to fix the crisis. And eventually, inevitably, the city would back down from whatever enforcement action they had contemplated. Jimmy Brown knew that he held the health and sanitation of 8 million people hostage, and he wielded that power with quiet confidence.
But there is a darker theory about Jimmy Brown and his trucks, a theory that brings us to one of the greatest mysteries in American history, a disappearance that has spawned countless books and documentaries and wild speculation. Jimmy Hoffa. We all know the name, even if we don't know all the details. The powerful Teamsters union leader who vanished from a restaurant parking lot in Michigan in 1975, supposedly on his way to meet with mob figures to discuss his return to union leadership. For 50 years, people have speculated wildly about his fate. Is he buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey? Is he encased in a concrete foundation somewhere? Did they dissolve his body in acid? The theories are endless, each more dramatic than the last. But listen to the whispers of the old-timers, the people who actually worked in the industry. Listen to the people who really understand the mechanics of the disposal business, who know how things actually worked rather than how they're portrayed in movies. The most credible theory isn't glamorous or cinematic. It doesn't involve a secret burial with mob bosses standing around paying their respects. The theory is that Hoffa was taken to a local sanitation facility owned by the mob, possibly in New Jersey, possibly in Michigan itself. Think about the timeline carefully. He vanishes from a parking lot in broad daylight. No body is ever found despite massive FBI investigations. No clothes turn up, no forensic trace is ever discovered. If he was placed into a commercial compactor, or worse, an industrial shredder used for recycling metal and waste, he wouldn't be under a stadium. He would be part of a recycled cube of scrap metal that was shipped overseas to make cars in Japan or Korea, or simply buried under 50 feet of fill in a Jersey dump that has since been covered by shopping malls and housing developments. It's a chilling thought, isn't it, that the most famous missing person in history might have been processed like a discarded appliance, fed through industrial machinery designed to break down and compress waste. It shows the cold industrial efficiency of the mob at its peak, when they had perfected the art of making problems disappear. They didn't just kill their enemies, they recycled them, turning human beings into raw materials that could be reprocessed and forgotten. But it wasn't just about high-profile targets like union leaders and federal witnesses. The sanitation business fundamentally changed the psychology of the soldier on the street, the made men and associates who carried out the organization's dirty work. When you know you have a get-out-of-jail-free card for murder, when you know that bodies can vanish without a trace, you act differently. You become bolder, more reckless. The fear of getting caught fades away, replaced by a sense of invulnerability. Disputes that might have been resolved with threats or beatings escalate to murder because the consequences are minimal. The barrier between life and death becomes thinner, more permeable. I often wonder what it was like for the drivers, the men who actually operated these trucks. These weren't always made men, full members of the family who had taken blood oaths. Sometimes they were just associates, guys trying to earn a living and make their way up through the organization. Imagine driving your route in the pre-dawn darkness, the streets empty except for the occasional drunk stumbling home from a bar. Imagine knowing that among the bags of restaurant leftovers in the back of your truck, among the office papers and construction debris, there is something that used to be a human being, someone who laughed and cried and loved and feared just like you. You verify the crush, making sure everything has been properly compressed. You drive to the dump, following the same route you've taken 1,000 times before. You pull the lever, watching as tons of garbage cascade out into the waiting pit. And then you go home to your family and have breakfast with your wife and kids, maybe help with homework, maybe watch some television. The compartmentalization required to do that is terrifying to contemplate. It turns murder into a chore, something you check off your list like taking out the actual trash or mowing the lawn. It turns a life, with all its complexity and relationships and unrealized potential, into a line item on a ledger, a problem solved, a task completed. This industrialization of death is what separates the American Mafia from a common street gang. A street gang leaves a body in the street because they are angry, because they want respect, because they are driven by emotion. The Mafia removes a body because it is a liability, because witnesses can testify, because corpses generate investigations. It is a business decision, cold and rational and utterly devoid of humanity.
But as we moved into the 80s and 90s, things began to change in ways the mob bosses hadn't anticipated. The RICO statutes came in, giving prosecutors powerful new tools to dismantle entire criminal organizations. The federal government launched a massive assault on the cartels of the garbage industry, dedicating enormous resources to breaking the mob's grip on waste management. They brought in undercover agents who posed as waste management consultants, recording conversations about price fixing and market allocation. They recorded the threats, the arson, the systematic intimidation that kept competitors out of the market. They flipped informants, offering deals to lower-level operators in exchange for testimony against the bosses. Slowly, painfully, over years of investigation and prosecution, the grip loosened. The big corporate waste companies moved in, national firms with professional management and legitimate business practices. The property rights system was dismantled in court, declared an illegal restraint of trade. But I want to ask you a question, one that should make you think about the world around you. Do you think it's really gone? Do you think that criminal influence in waste management just evaporated like morning dew? Sure, the names on the trucks have changed to corporate logos, Waste Management, Republic Services, big national brands with stock prices and earnings reports. The drivers wear neon safety vests now and go through formal training programs. But the nature of the business, the grit, the shadows, the fact that it happens while we are all asleep, that hasn't fundamentally changed. Waste is still the one place nobody wants to look, the one industry that operates in the margins of society's consciousness. If you wanted to hide something today, right now, in 2026, where would you put it? The cloud? No, digital trails are forever, backed up on servers around the world and recoverable by forensic experts. You would put it in the one place that society is designed to ignore, the one place we actively avoid thinking about. You would throw it away.
There is a profound lesson here about the nature of evil, about where darkness actually resides in our world. We tend to look for evil in the obvious places, in the dark alleys where muggers lurk, in the violent shouts of domestic disputes, in the dramatic crimes that make headlines. But sometimes the darkest things are hiding in the mundane machinery of our daily lives, in the systems and services we depend on but never really examine. The Mafia didn't invent garbage. They didn't create waste or develop the technology to manage it. They just realized something that the rest of society overlooked. That because we are so desperate to get rid of our trash, so eager to have it taken away and forgotten, we wouldn't look too closely at who was taking it or what else they were taking with it. They understood that if you control the sanitation, you control the secrets. And in that understanding, in that exploitation of society's willful blindness, they built an empire of death that operated in plain sight for decades.